With us now, Astan Goolsbee, a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Good morning.
Good morning.
What's your reaction to the tax? What's the White House reaction to this tax on AIG? And does the White House have any intention of either backing it up or how is the White House going to get this money back?
Well, the president's been pretty forthright in his anger at what happened with AIG, and the simplest thing is for these guys to give the money back. The president's also been clear, we don't want to govern out of anger. He's going to look at what comes out of the House, what comes out of the Senate, see what ideas we have. At the least, there is public pressure, and there should be public pressure on those people at AIG who aren't being paid for performance but are being paid for having lost $170 billion to give the money back.
Does the White House have an understanding of what people beyond the Potomac, beyond the Beltway, feel is going on here? There's like a fire hydrant of cash flowing into Wall Street.
Right.
And the folks at home feel like, well, there's nobody at the switch.
Well, yes, the White House and the president above all understands that. You know, as he says, it's one thing to be a gambler and to gamble with your own money. But here they're gambling with the retirement accounts of our parents and the college funds of our children, you know, and things like that. So he absolutely understands that, and that's the place that he comes from, is let's get out of this bubble. Go talk to somebody in Chicago or Iowa or wherever. They're extremely upset, and they have good reason to be upset. These companies would not exist if it weren't for the U.S. government. Now that makes them different than some of the other institutions, which I'm sure we'll talk about with the financial rescue, but we can't let our anger over mistakes that happened last year block the fact that we've got to save the economy. Okay. I mean, we have to fix this problem.
Let's talk about the toxic asset bailout, which is going to be unveiled this week. Just in bare bones, what can you tell me about it?
The announcement itself is going to be tomorrow, and they're going to outline other things as it goes through this week. The basic idea is outlining the details of a public-private partnership so that we leverage money from the government with the private sector so that the government doesn't get in the business of overpaying for assets and things like that.
And you know, there's already grumblings from the private sector that if the federal government is going to be so heavily involved, they don't want anything to do with it.
Well, I know some people have rumored that. You quoted the CEO of Bank of America. Most of the people saying that so far have been people who are on the hook and have received a lot of money from the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. What we saw this week and what we have seen in our discussions with people is that if you lay out clear rules that are responsible, people want to participate if there's a business reason to participate. Mm-hmm. And in this circumstance where we're trying to encourage the private sector to participate, that's going to be treated totally differently than companies like AIG or Fannie Mae, where they are only in business because the government saved them.
Right. One of the other aspects of this whole thing that's going to be talked about this week from the White House is this idea of putting controls on executive compensation. People are going to have their hair on fire talking about this, that the government is somehow going to have its hand in the control of private enterprise.
I would characterize that as not an accurate description of what the president's policy is. I've seen the article that you're describing. The president has, for more than a year, been calling for financial regulatory reform, and the centerpiece of that regulatory reform is to prevent the $170 billion bailouts of AIG type, where a life insurance company morphs into a hedge fund, turns into a huge loss, is too big to fail, and the government has to come in. The point of regulatory reform is to prevent that.
All right, but there's been a lot of negative press about this thing that hasn't even been unveiled yet, and Paul Krugman in his blog today said, for the private investors, this is an open invitation to play. Heads I win, tails the taxpayers lose.
I don't think that's an accurate description. I mean, if the government doesn't make money, the private sector doesn't make money either. I mean, these guys are coming in a partnership, and one of the reasons you want to have the partnership is precisely so that A, the government doesn't massively overpay for these troubled assets that are on the balance sheets, and B, so that everybody's got skin in the game and you don't get into situations where you're paying guys for failure.
I want to talk about the budget a little bit, because the Congressional Budget Office came out with a description of the deficit, which is significantly larger than the White House's estimate. How does this potentially endanger the White House's budget plans?
Well, I would say two things about the CBO report. One, on a technical level, the primary difference between the CBO and really most other forecasters is they're much more pessimistic about the long-run strength of the U.S. economy. 7, 8, 10 years down the road, they believe that the growth rate will be significantly slower than it was in the long run in the past. The government is more in line with the private forecasters. But even in the CBO numbers, you see that the president's goals of cutting the deficit in half while investing in health care, in the clean energy economy, and in the education of our kids.
Is there any sense in the White House?
The CBO shows that he is able to do that.
That's my question. Is there anything in this budget that is expendable if the deficit is so huge, moderates, folks in the middle just aren't going to be able to go along with
The
it?
president is committed, as I say, to cutting the deficit in half by the end of his first term. He's going to be working with Congress. He's outlined a budget program and these principles of making those three key investments and cutting the deficit in half, and I believe he's going to be able to do that.
Austin Goolsbee, we thank you for your time this morning.
Great to see you.
Do appreciate it.